In part 1 of the story, Grace Thompson's world crumbled after losing her father, forcing her to drop out of school to care for her sick mother and younger brother. Struggling with poverty, she worked tirelessly but could barely provide for her family. Desperate, she accepted a live-in maid job with the wealthy Blake family in exchange for monthly stipends to support her loved ones. But life in the mansion was far from kind. Grace was overworked, mocked, and treated as less than human, unaware that her fate was about to cross paths with the Blake's only billionaire son, Daniel. Now the story continues. By day, Grace was the maid, silent, invisible, and unwanted. By night, she became something else, something even she couldn't explain. Every morning, Grace tied her scarf, slipped into her worn apron, and walked the halls of the Blake mansion as though her body didn't ache from the night before. Not from labor, but from love. The kind that made her heart race and her mind spin with confusion. A love she was terrified to name. Daniel had become her secret, her beautiful, dangerous secret. He watched her in ways no one else did. Not just with desire, but with a gentleness that made her question everything she believed about herself. In the dead of night, when the mansion lights were low and the world slept, she felt seen, wanted, respected. But once the sun returned, so did the walls between them. She could hear the laughter of Charlotte and her rich friends echoing through the hallways. They wore diamonds and designer shoes and sipped imported teas. They'd point at her behind her back, laugh at her rough hands, her frizzy hair, her patched-up uniform. And Daniel, her Daniel, would walk past without a word. He had to. In public, he was the billionaire's son. She was still the maid. Crushed her sometimes. To serve tea in a room where he sat laughing with elegant girls who wore perfect makeup and didn't scrub toilets. To wipe the same floor he walked on, pretending not to notice the quick glance he gave her when no one was looking. She didn't blame him. She knew the rules of the world she lived in. People like her weren't supposed to be loved, especially not by someone like him. But at night, everything changed. He would meet her in the laundry room with that boyish smile and whisper her name like it meant something. He'd ask about her mother, her brother, her dreams. No one had ever asked her about dreams before. One night, he found her crying quietly in the kitchen, too tired to pretend she was okay. "Grace, talk to me," he said, kneeling beside her. She looked away. "You shouldn't be here." "Why not?" "Because I'm no one. And you have everything. We don't belong in the same world." He gently lifted her chin. "I don't care about that world. Not when I'm with you." His words felt like warmth on a winter night. But fear still lived inside her. And more than fear, doubt. "Daniel," she hesitated. What is this to you?" He blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, this whatever we're doing. What's the end of it? I know the only way you'll stay is if we keep hiding. And I'll keep hiding. For you. But every time I do, I lose a part of myself. I can't pretend forever." He was quiet, the weight of her words settling in. She gave a small, pained laugh. "You don't have to answer. I already know. This world, your world, will never let someone like me belong in it. I'm not asking for promises. Just be honest with me." Daniel reached for her hand and held it gently, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please be patient with me, while I figure out how to let my family know without hurting you or them." Grace stared at him for a long moment. Her heart wanted to believe it. Her soul begged for it to be true. But the fear of being a passing secret still lingered. Each day, Grace lived in two worlds. One of silver trays and sharp insults, and another of quiet whispers and forbidden kisses. And she feared the day those two worlds would collide. Vanessa Harper had always believed, without a single doubt, that she would one day become Mrs. Daniel Blake. It wasn't just about class, although their families were among the wealthiest and most influential in the country. It wasn't just about their years of shared spaces, the same schools, the same elite clubs, the same extravagant galas where they were often photographed standing side by side. No, Vanessa's confidence ran deeper than that. Their parents were close friends, the kind who toasted at New Year's parties and whispered about legacy marriages behind crystal glasses. Evelyn Blake had once placed her hand over Vanessa's and said with a smile, "You'd make a perfect daughter-in-law." That moment had sealed it. Vanessa had taken that smile as a promise. She was sure that Mrs. Blake would do anything, absolutely anything, to make the marriage happen. And Daniel? Well, he'd fall in line eventually. Men like him always did. So when news broke of Daniel's homecoming, the tech sensation returning from Silicon Valley, fresh off a billion-dollar deal, Vanessa dressed for fate. Silk, heels, subtle lipstick. She walked into the Blake mansion like a queen returning to her castle. But something was wrong. From the moment she arrived, Daniel felt distant, polite, but distracted. He didn't linger in conversations. His attention drifted, not to any of the girls seated around him, but across the room, to someone standing in the shadows. It took Vanessa a few days to notice who. The maid. That girl with a tired face and second-hand clothes. Always quiet, always busy, always disappearing into corners. Grace. First, Vanessa laughed it off. Daniel? Interested in her? Impossible. But something didn't sit right. She started watching. Closely. She saw it, the glances, the softening in his eyes, the times he paused when Grace walked by, as if her presence changed the air. She began to take note of how often they were in the same space, how often he asked for his room to be cleaned again, how he'd linger when she served food. Then, one afternoon, Vanessa followed her instincts. Grace had just cleared the table when she slipped into the hallway. Vanessa, walking softly in heels, followed her, past the grand staircase, past the gallery of family portraits. Grace turned into the laundry room. Seconds later, Daniel walked in the same direction, looked both ways, and entered the room. 10 minutes passed. That was all Vanessa needed. That evening, she stormed into Charlotte Blake's bedroom, fury bubbling under her skin. "Your brother is sneaking around with the maid." Charlotte blinked. "Excuse me?" "Grace," Vanessa spat. "I saw them. Together. Alone." He looked at her like she mattered. Charlotte, always quick to defend her brother, hesitated. "Daniel wouldn't." "He would," Vanessa snapped. "And he is." She crossed her arms. "You know your mother wants him to marry me. We all do. And that girl, that thing in your house. She could ruin everything. Imagine the scandal. Evelyn's reputation. Your family's name. You really think she'll let that happen?" Charlotte was quiet for a moment. As much as she didn't want to believe it, she had seen it too. Daniel's strange protectiveness around Grace. The way he scowled when anyone was harsh to her. The way he once ignored Vanessa mid-sentence just to ask if Grace was okay. "I'll tell Mother," Charlotte finally said. "She'll fix it." Vanessa smiled, the first genuine smile in days. Good. Because if anyone can make that girl disappear, it's her. Mrs. Evelyn Blake was enjoying an afternoon cocktail when Charlotte broke the news. First, she laughed it off. "Daniel? With that maid? Please, Charlotte. Don't be absurd." "I'm serious, Mother." Vanessa saw them together. "And I've seen it too. He watches her. Talks to her. It's strange." Vanessa added, "They've been alone together. More than once." Evelyn's smile faded. Her grip tightened around the glass. This is not happening. But somewhere deep inside, she had seen the signs too. Daniel's recent softness, the glances, his subtle defiance. She had dismissed it, thinking it was just boredom or maybe pity. But now, this wasn't just unacceptable, it was dangerous. She stood up, her voice trembling with fury. That girl, that quiet, soft-spoken girl with eyes too big and dreams too small, had managed to capture her son's attention, maybe even his heart. Evelyn said nothing, but her mind was racing. This was not a battle she would fight with noise or tantrums. No, she had power and she knew how to use it quietly, elegantly. One thing was clear. Grace had overstepped her place, and she would be reminded, subtly, painfully, of exactly where she belonged. Downstairs, Grace was folding laundry, unaware that the walls were closing in. She had felt the shift in the air, the stares, the silence that followed her into rooms. She tried to tell herself it was just her imagination, but something told her the secret wasn't safe anymore, and she was right. Everything was about to change. Daniel had only been gone for 5 days, just a short business trip, a few meetings, a quick appearance at a tech summit. Before he left, Grace had quietly walked him to the garden gate after dinner. They didn't speak much, just one last look, a small smile, and the gentle touch of her hand in his. He had whispered, "I'll be back soon. Wait for me." But when he returned, the house felt different. Too quiet, too hollow. He walked through the front door expecting to see her. Maybe serving tea, arranging flowers in the sitting room, or cleaning the hallway with her usual soft steps. But Grace was nowhere. "Where's Grace?" he asked Ruth, the chief maid. Ruth hesitated. Her eyes dropped. "She left, sir." Daniel frowned. "Left?" "Yes, sir. The day after you traveled. She packed her things and said she wouldn't be working with us anymore. She didn't give a reason." Daniel's breath caught in his chest. "What do you mean she didn't give a reason? That doesn't make sense," he said, his voice shaking. "Did she say anything to anyone? Did anyone upset her?" Ruth shook her head slowly. "No one knows why. She didn't speak much. Just left." His heart slammed inside him. He rushed upstairs into his room. The place they had whispered in the dark, laughed quietly, shared pieces of themselves. He checked the corners where she used to fold his clothes, the window where she'd once watched the stars. Everything looked untouched, cold, gone. No note, no message, no trace. He tried calling the estate office. Maybe they had her address. They didn't. Tried messaging one of the junior maids, but none of them knew where she had gone. It was as if she had disappeared. Why would she leave like this? He didn't suspect his mother or sister because she was sure no one knew about their secret affair. Had she grown tired of hiding? Did she feel ashamed of their love? Or was she afraid? Afraid of his world, his name, his family? Daniel sat on the edge of his bed, burying his face in his hands. The guilt was heavy. He had promised her something, even if he hadn't said it out loud. He had wanted to tell his family. He had planned to tell his mother before leaving the country again. He had even thought of how he would explain it all. How Grace wasn't just a maid. How she had changed his heart, his vision, his entire life. But now she was gone, and he had no way to find her. How could he tell his mother he had lost someone she never even knew he loved? How could he explain that he was in love with the maid, someone he was very sure they detested? He didn't sleep that night. Every sound made him think she had returned. Every footstep outside his door made his heart race. But it was never her. The next morning, the pressure began. His mother, Evelyn Blake, walked into his room with a soft smile and 2 golden rings in her palm. "Vanessa's parents are asking for a date," she said gently. "I told them we're close to finalizing the engagement. All you have to do is say yes." This was the umpteenth time his mother had approached him with the proposal to engage Vanessa. He had always asked her to give him time. Daniel looked away. He didn't have the strength to argue. His world had just collapsed. His heart felt like it had been ripped out and thrown into the wind. "Fine," he mumbled. Evelyn raised her brows, surprised. "You agree? I'll get engaged to her before I leave the country," he said, his voice flat. "I will take my time to get to know her before returning for the wedding." It wasn't love. It was delay. He needed time, needed space, needed to think. And maybe she'd return. But deep down, he feared she wouldn't. Later that evening, As the house buzzed with talk of the engagement, Daniel walked quietly to the servant quarters. He found Ruth, standing by the back door, folding towels. He took a deep breath. "Ruth, if you ever hear from Grace," he said softly, "please tell her I'm looking for her, that I need to talk to her, that she meant something real." Ruth looked into his eyes. She had seen their glances, heard the silence between them, felt the storm building. "I'll keep searching," she promised. He nodded. "Even if it takes months. Don't stop." As the sun set behind the Blake estate, Daniel stood alone on the balcony, staring into the garden where he last saw Grace. Everything in him ached. Her laughter, her touch, her soft voice. They haunted him now. He never thought he could feel so empty, with a house so full. He had lost her, and he didn't even know why. Vanessa Harper couldn't hide her smile. She stood beside Charlotte on the wide staircase, watching the maids move around the mansion. Grace was gone. Finally. She was always in the way, Vanessa whispered with satisfaction. Now things can go back to how they should be. Charlotte laughed lightly. That girl thought she mattered. Just a maid pretending to be something else. Daniel will see clearly now. Vanessa smirked. He has no choice. Our parents want this. Your mother will make sure it happens. And they were right. Mrs. Evelyn Blake walked around with quiet pride. Everything had gone exactly as planned. She had done what she needed to do to protect her son and the family name. That poor girl, Grace, was simply a distraction. A mistake. One she had corrected. Far away, in a quiet corner of the city, Grace stood in her family's small home. The air was warm and still. The roof still leaked in the corner. The paint still peeled on the wall. It was like nothing had changed, except for her heart. She sat beside her mother, gently feeding her soup. Her younger brother played silently on the floor. They were happy to have her home. But Grace, she was empty inside. Her mother had asked questions. Not all, just a few. "I thought the job was helping us," Mama said gently. "Why did you leave, my child?" Grace hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "It got hard," she whispered. "They said they didn't need me anymore." Her mother looked worried. "Did something happen? Did they mistreat you?" Grace shook her head. "No, not really." But her eyes betrayed the truth. There was pain. Deep, silent pain. She couldn't say it. Couldn't speak of the nights she shared with Daniel. Couldn't explain the way her heart had opened to someone so far above her world. She had believed, maybe, just maybe, she mattered to him. But they had taken her away without a word. No goodbye. No explanation. No chance to even see him again. Every morning since she returned, she sat by the window. Her eyes scanned the road, hoping to see someone, anyone, coming for her. Daniel. She hoped he would come, that he would fight for her, that maybe, just maybe, everything they shared meant something to him too. But the days passed. 1, 2, a week. Nothing. No one came. She cried at night when no one could hear. What was she thinking? That a billionaire would chase after a maid? That someone like him would love someone like her? He had kissed her, held her, whispered things that made her believe. But maybe it was just a game. Maybe he had already moved on. Maybe she had just been a beautiful distraction. Nothing more. "I was foolish," she whispered to herself. "I should have known." Her hope turned to silence. Her dreams back into dust. She told herself it was better this way. That the mansion was never her home. That Daniel never truly belonged to her. It was all just a borrowed dream. And the time had come to wake up. She started looking for small jobs again, washing clothes, cleaning shops, helping market women. Anything to bring food home. Each time someone asked why she returned, she just smiled and said, "I missed my family." But inside, she was still broken. The secret she held now was too heavy. The memories of his touch, his voice, his eyes, they followed her like shadows. Still, she moved forward. Quietly, slowly. Her mother noticed the sadness in her eyes, but said nothing. Maybe she understood that some pain must be healed in silence. One evening, as Grace folded clothes outside, her brother came running. "Auntie Grace, will you go back to that big house again one day?" Grace looked at him, tears filling her eyes. She smiled faintly and said, "No, my sweet, that was just a place I passed through." But in her heart, she still wondered. What if he did care? What if he's searching? What if he just hasn't found me yet? Then again, what if he never will? So she let the thoughts go, or tried to. She buried them under daily work, under duty, under the weight of survival. And she told herself over and over, it was never real. It was never meant to last. But somewhere far away, in a mansion now filled with new guests and empty laughter, a young man sat in his room. Staring at a photo he secretly took of a girl with messy hair and the purest eyes he had ever seen. And neither of them knew the story wasn't over yet. Not even close. The morning was quiet, but something didn't feel right. Grace stood in front of the tiny mirror nailed to the cracked wall, pressing her hand gently on her stomach. She had felt weak for days. The nausea, the dizziness, the sudden tiredness. At first, she thought it was stress. From all the crying, the confusion, the heartbreak. But now she knew. She was late. Too late. Her hands shook as she sat on the edge of her narrow bed. Her breath came fast. A terrible thought gripped her chest. She was pregnant. Tears welled up in her eyes. "No, no, no," she whispered to herself. She wasn't ready. Not now. Not like this. There was no job. No father beside her. No plan. And worst of all, no one to call. No one to run to. Her heart pounded wildly in her chest. She wanted to scream, to curse the world, to turn back time. But nothing could change this. The child inside her was real. She ran to the backyard, covered her mouth, and threw up violently behind the old fence. That evening, her mother noticed her red eyes and trembling hands. "What is it?" Mama asked, gently placing a hand on Grace's back. "You're not well." I need to tell you something," Grace said, her voice breaking. They sat quietly in the dim light. And for the first time, Grace told her mother the full story. She spoke of the mansion, of the pain, the joy, the shame, of Daniel, the young man who had shown her a world she never knew, the one who had kissed her, held her, whispered promises, and then disappeared. She cried as she spoke. Her voice shook as she said, "Mama, I didn't plan this. I swear. I didn't even get to say goodbye to him. They took me away. Just like that. I never even knew I was pregnant." Her mother sat quietly, eyes full of shock and sadness. "My child. Oh, my poor child." Grace looked down, shame covering her like a heavy blanket. "I've brought disgrace to this house," she whispered. "You worked so hard to raise me right. Now look at me." Her mother wiped her tears and took her hand. "You're not disgraceful. You're hurt. You trusted someone who didn't fight for you. But don't let this break you completely." News of her condition spread quickly through the neighborhood. Women stared. Men laughed. Young girls whispered behind her back. "She's spoiled now. Another one who couldn't control herself. See what she brought from that big mansion." Even women who once smiled at her now crossed the street to avoid her. She became the village shame, a warning to every daughter. At night, Grace curled up under her blanket, tears soaking her pillow. The loneliness crushed her more than the poverty ever could. She thought about it. Maybe if she ended it, the pain would end too. One morning, she walked toward the small clinic nearby. Her steps were heavy, her mind torn. But before she entered, she felt a gentle tug on her wrapper. Her little brother had followed her. He looked up at her, eyes wide and innocent. "Auntie Grace, are you sick again?" Her lips trembled. "No, baby," she whispered. Not sick. He hugged her waist tightly, and something inside her broke. She turned around and went home. Later that night, she sat by her mother, holding a cup of warm water. "Mama, I thought about ending it." Her mother looked up sharply, eyes full of fear. "Grace, I didn't do it," Grace said quickly. "But I thought about it. I didn't want to bring a child into this pain, into this shame." Her mother was silent for a moment. Then she took her hand. "Grace, listen to me," she said softly. "A baby is a gift. No matter how they come, they carry new beginnings. You may not see it now, but that child could become your greatest blessing." Grace broke down in tears, her head resting on her mother's lap. "I'm so scared, Mama." "I know," her mother whispered, stroking her hair. "But you're not alone." That night, Grace made a decision. She would carry the child. She would protect it, love it, raise it with whatever strength she had left. And even though her heart still ached for Daniel, even though her nights were filled with what-ifs and unanswered questions, she chose to fight, not just for herself, but for the life growing inside her. Because sometimes, even in the middle of heartbreak, something beautiful begins to grow. Daniel returned home after 5 long months. His flight had landed early, and though the house was decorated for the wedding, his heart felt heavy. The last few months abroad had not brought him peace. No matter how hard he tried to focus on work, his thoughts always circled back to Grace. Her laughter, her soft voice, the warmth in her eyes. She had vanished like smoke, and it haunted him. Ruth, the chief maid, watched him closely as he entered the mansion. He looked different, older, more distant. His steps lacked joy. Even as his mother excitedly discussed flowers, guest lists, and venues with Vanessa and her friends, Daniel barely smiled. He was there but not present. He still hadn't heard from Ruth. Before traveling, he had begged her to help him find Grace. But 5 months passed and not a single word. He had assumed maybe Grace didn't want to be found. Or worse, she had moved on. That afternoon, Daniel called Ruth aside. "Anything from Grace?" he asked quietly, his eyes full of tired hope. Ruth looked away. "Nothing, sir. I'm sorry, but it was a lie." She had found out. Weeks ago, she had contacted the agent who helped Madame Evelyn hire Grace. The woman had reluctantly given her the address of Grace's former neighborhood. Ruth had paid a boy from that area to ask around, and what he came back with shattered her heart. Grace was pregnant, and alone. Ruth didn't know who the father was. Maybe it was Daniel, maybe not. But she had seen enough pain in Grace's eyes back then to guess the truth. She knew Grace had left with a broken heart. And now, carrying a child, she couldn't imagine the weight the poor girl was bearing. But what could Ruth do? She worked for Evelyn Blake, a woman with sharp eyes and a cruel heart when crossed. She had made it clear Grace was not to be spoken of again. And Vanessa acted like she already owned the mansion. She barked orders at staff, belittled Ruth in front of visitors, and walked around like a queen. Yet Daniel seemed lost. He barely looked at Vanessa, only responding to her with short nods and fake smiles. Ruth could see it, he wasn't in love. He was trying, painfully trying, to follow the path his mother had carved for him. 2 nights before the wedding, Vanessa threw a small gathering at the mansion. Laughter and loud music filled the halls. Charlotte and Evelyn beamed as Vanessa paraded herself like the new Madame Blake. Ruth stood quietly by the hallway, holding a tray of drinks, as Vanessa snapped her fingers and shouted orders. "She doesn't belong here," Ruth muttered to herself. "She doesn't care about anyone but herself." That night, Ruth couldn't sleep. She sat on her small bed, staring at Grace's address in her notebook. Her fingers trembled. She knew it was time. She knocked on Daniel's door just before midnight. He opened it, surprised. "Ruth, I have something to tell you," she said, her voice low but steady. About Grace. Daniel's eyes widened. You found her. She nodded slowly. She's back in her neighborhood. She's pregnant, sir. He froze. Pregnant? I don't know if the baby is yours, Ruth said quickly. But I know she left here heartbroken. She didn't even get a chance to see you before they sent her away. I wanted to tell you, but I was scared. Scared of your mother. Scared of what it could do to this house. Daniel sat down heavily on the edge of his bed, his heart racing. She's pregnant, he whispered. Ruth gently placed the paper with Grace's address in his hand. I couldn't let her suffer alone. You deserved to know. Daniel looked up, emotion flooding his eyes. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you. The next morning, Daniel left the mansion without telling anyone. His mind was spinning. What if the baby was his? What if Grace had waited, hoping he would find her? What if she thought he abandoned her? He remembered the nights they shared, the way she smiled up at him under the moonlight. He had tried, truly tried, to feel something for Vanessa. He had gone on outings, smiled at her friends, even kissed her. But it was hollow. Grace was different. Grace was real. I need to know the truth, he whispered to himself as the car sped toward the dusty neighborhood Grace once called home. I need to see her, and what he found there would decide everything. The wedding, his future, his heart. And so, just days before his wedding, Daniel races against time and truth. His heart leading him back to the girl they forced him to forget. But will Grace welcome him? Will the baby be his? And what happens if his mother finds out? Don't miss the explosive final part of this emotional journey. Part 3 drops soon. And trust us, you won't want to blink.